questions we wrestle with as Christians about who God is, how do we live out our faith, what is the Bible, what is the truth of the Bible, what are we supposed to believe, how are we supposed to live? There are really big, deep questions that we ask each other, that we ask God, that we wrestle with ourselves. And that's why the Cultivate podcast exists, to help us go deeper in our understanding of who God is, His Word, and the way that He's called us to live. Hey everyone, thank you for joining us at the Cultivate podcast. Charlie Lofton, lead pastor there. And we have with us Bible expert, Old Testament expert, and from a previous episode, Mormon faith expert, Scott Sutton.
Thanks.
How you doing, dude?
Good. It's a lot of experts. I don't think I'm going to live up to the
accept
billing.
that? You accept it.
Maybe the Mormon one, but Old Testament,
no,
I'm still learning.
I don't know. We'll find out. We'll find out here in a little bit. So, hey, Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we are, if you guys have been with us for a while, we have at the church during the summer of 2024, we're kind of doing a Bible study of sorts called, I want to call it Summer Slam, which is in fact a wrestling deal. Summer seminar. Summer seminar, a different speaker every time, kind of working our way through a few hot topics. And you recently did some of the teaching for that. And I was out of town, but I understand that it went incredibly well. Did you feel good about it?
It's good to know. I was sweating the whole time, so I don't know. I just kind of go up there.
Like literally sweating?
Yeah, it gets hot back there, and also I just kind of black out a little bit when I do my public speak. So
okay.
Yeah.
And so the question that you were asked, pretty big one, is the God of the Old Testament the same as the God of the New Testament? Is that how it was phrased? Okay. So it's actually pretty simple. It's a yes/no question.
Yeah.
So yes or no?
Yes.
Oh, well, there you go. Thank you so much
That's a good one.
for joining us today. Okay. So the question is the God of the Old Testament the same as the New Testament? So why don't you just help me understand the framing of that question? I mean, because on one hand, you're kind of like, bro, it's just one book. I mean, it's one book. Obviously, it's the same God. What makes people ask that question?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I'm sure you've been exploring this for years yourself. So it's you read the New Testament. I think a lot of us a lot of the scripture we hear quoted is coming from New Testament letters and the Gospels. Right. When we go to study the scriptures, the New Testament feels a little more comfortable to us. The God that has kind of pervaded our culture is a very New Testament feeling God of Jesus sacrificing salvation, and so we come to the Bible with that context, and then we go back to the Old Testament and we start reading about laws, and we start reading about even punishment for rebellion, and we start to say, okay, this feels different, and then we're kind of confronted with like, what am I missing? Like it seems like I'm almost dealing with two different sets of rules, two different expectations, two different gods. Even I feel like some people even come to.
So you said it's a good question, which I agree. Do you feel like when you get this question asked and you hear people talking about it, do you feel like people are asking it in good faith, like, hey, help me reconcile these two things? Or do you feel like it's kind of more of a, oh man, the Bible it's not even the same, flip the table over, walk away? You feel like it's a good faith question?
Yeah, no, that's good. So I feel like if I were to like kind of bucket, I feel like there are kind of three different buckets. There's the one bucket of like, I am completely lost, like help me.
Right.
There's the bucket of, I think I got it, I want to understand it, but I can't make the pieces fit. But then I do feel like you get the group that is coming to it more like, okay, that's this archaic kind of that's the old, the disposed of, the more antiquated view of God, and this is the new view of God, and it almost does have this like, let's toss out one for the other, or even kind of like a gotcha, like, well, hey, if your God feels this way, as Jesus spoke, then how do you explain this? And it's kind of this like gotcha kind of thing. So I feel like you have the three buckets of people who are just genuinely lost, people who are trying to figure it out, and people who are using the supposed discrepancies as a way of like just throwing the whole thing out.
Right. And I feel like too with that, there's also people who are just trying to parse the Bible into just the parts that they like. And sometimes it'll start with that, where it's just like, Mom, in the Old Testament, that God's just, he's angry and judgmental and all these things. We can get rid of that. I mean, it's really about what Jesus says God is like. And then you get to the New Testament and you're like, well, Paul, he's kind of a sexist and he says things I don't like. And so, well, some of these stories about Jesus, they probably made those up. And then you just kind of end up with just a handful of things that you agree with.
Right.
And really it's a question of, they're just parts of the Bible I don't like.
Yeah. That's I think that's and you know, I would actually say that it's okay to not like to hold two truths at the same time, to say I don't like this, I'm not comfortable with it, I don't understand it, and it's true. And like to sit with that and even wrestle with it. I mean,
right.
That's something we talked about is this idea of wrestling. But yeah, so I think the trick is to like hold these two truths together.
Yeah, so we're going to be real tempted to jump into that.
Yeah.
But I want the wrestling. How do we wrestle when we come across either a difficult truth or two things that I'm having a hard time reconciling in some way? Kind of the art of wrestling. I want us to spend some time talking about it. I know we will end up talking about it a little bit right now, but that's going to be our next episode.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
Let's do it. All right.
So I appreciate that. So let's just assume that it's being, again, we're talking to people who are asking this question in good faith, and not people who are looking for a reason to slice and dice the Bible and ultimately remove its authority, and so I can be my own authority, which is really kind of where that train goes. But it's just like, I'm trying to understand the Bible, and I read about who Jesus is, I read the Old Testament, and I'm somehow having a hard time. Give me some examples maybe of some things from the Old Testament that kind of, maybe if you have like what you said, just kind of a very New Testament mindset, some things from the Old Testament that kind of make people go, what?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, a couple that come to my mind, things that I've just, you know, wrestled with over the years have been things like you read about the conquest narrative where Joshua is leading the Israelites into the promised land. And, you know, there's a lot of killing that happens. And then fast forward to, you know, the New Testament where Jesus is saying, you know, I've come to save all, you know, that Paul's saying, you know, spread the gospel into the world. And so it's like, we're bringing good news to the world, you know, the Great Commission. And then we have to reconcile that with, you know, this conquest where people were killed and seemingly under the, you know, the God's kind of command.
If you take it at its most straightforward way, God tells them to do this. God said, "Hey, go to this town, kill everyone. Don't leave anyone else.
Yeah.
Don't leave anyone alive."
Right. And how do you reconcile that with go to all the nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? That seems like two different gods that we're dealing with.
Yeah. So one God, if you don't worship me and you're not following me, take him out. And the other, in the New Testament, it's his heart is breaking for people who don't know him. Let's do everything we can to let as many people as possible know him.
That's right.
Yeah,
it's a big one. And you know, even then we go through. We're going through Exodus teaching series. We just got through the 10 Commandments, and you know, there's Jesus has commandments to love each other, and what are the two greatest commandments? Love God, love your neighbor. And it seems very like simple and principle based. But then you go to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and we're getting into like, what kind of clothes can I wear? Can I mix two threads together? Can I eat shrimp? And so you almost feel like, okay, well, which is it? Is it the one that says, it's telling me what I can eat? Or is it the one who's saying that, festivals don't matter, meat, not meat doesn't matter. Like the thing that matters is loving God. And so that feels like a discrepancy.
I don't know if you feel this way Scott is an elder in our church. I don't know if you feel this way. I feel this way as a pastor, that like I read those the laws and I think I like my job now. I don't know that I would want the job where I have to walk into your house and determine whether or not a certain amount of mold is going to spread or not, or whether or not a spot on your arm. Well, okay, last week it was the size of a dime. This week, it looks like maybe it's gotten a little small. I don't know. Maybe it's about the same, and then I have to investigate mold and those sorts of things. But it's pretty tedious.
Yeah, honestly,
like the number of laws, the details of it, and then you fast forward to the New Testament. It does seem like, oh man, just kind of sum it up. Just a couple things.
Yeah,
just love God, love people. I also feel like that some of this comes from people's perspective of who Jesus is.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the angry God who's killing, and then you got Jesus. Like, people who are asking this question, kind of, what do you feel like their perspective about Jesus is?
Yeah, that's a good point. It almost I see a few different things, and at the worst, it almost feels like people have this perception that Jesus is working against God, that it's almost like God is out to get us and Jesus is here to save us. And I feel that's the worst extreme. And then at the other extreme, maybe that's also unhealthy, is, man, it's just all about it's just about love. It's just, there's really nothing else matters as long as you're just a good person who loves. And so I feel like you have these two extremes that are both unhealthy, that of Jesus.
Yeah, you've got Jesus as this, God the Father of the Old Testament. God of the Old Testament is mean, but Jesus is super chill.
Yeah.
And most of the time it gets framed to me that way, with God is mean, Jesus is chill. And like, to me, I feel like we're doing both of them a huge disservice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That you read the Old Testament and all you see is, some people, all they see is this angry God, and you read the New Testament and all you see is this Jesus that's super nice to everybody all the time. Again, and it's just he's just all loving. I mean, you didn't really grow up you didn't really grow up going to church, so you may not even know what I'm talking about. It seemed like every Sunday school class in my church had some picture of Jesus. And it was either this one, the profile one, where he's just it's just his face and he's looking up like this, or it's one where he's standing up and he's got lamb.
Oh, nice.
He's got a lamb. Have you ever seen the picture of Jesus with the lamb around his neck? Like, sweet Jesus with the lamb.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Jesus wouldn't even harm a lamb. He'll carry a lamb on his back. He's so sweet, much less say anything. And so, to me, okay, you've got this contrast, at least in people's minds. God of the Old Testament mean, Jesus is only nice. How would you respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's and I think, again, when the question's asked in good earnest, like,
let's
seeking,
just assuming the best in whoever's asking the question.
Yeah, then I think the place to start is actually in Christ, and in my opinion, is to start with who is Jesus. Jesus in John says, if you've seen the Father, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That that he's the revelation. And Paul in his letters talks about Jesus being the exact representation of God. And so if we start at that place and work our way back, then I think it gives us a more well-rounded picture of who Jesus is, because Jesus and his followers and the early church didn't have any beef with this idea of Jesus being the God of the Old Testament. They didn't say, like, well, gosh, you're so different from the God that we know.
The people who knew him the best didn't seem to be like, you seem to be different.
Yeah. And this is a culture that, as you know, like, from the age of 8, they've memorized the Old Testament, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, like, memorized word for word at the age of 8. My 8-year-old, when my kids were 8, they could barely just spell their favorite cereal, but they've memorized the entire Torah. And then by the age of 12 or 13, they memorized the entire. So this is a culture that wasn't just working on superstition or belief about who God was. This is a culture that was encountering Jesus and knew the scripture by heart, front to back.
Right.
And they saw Jesus and they said, this is our God come down. Maybe not in the moment, maybe they just saw a prophet, maybe they saw, but certainly after the resurrection, as the church took hold, there wasn't this conflict. So I say kind of start with Christ and then work your way back. That what it will do is it will give you, when you see that Christ is the fulfillment of everything that's coming, it gives you a different perspective on the Old Testament. Then when you look backward of Christ looking back to the Old Testament and being the fulfillment, the summation, the accomplishment of all of it, it gives you a much more kind of a robust view of who Jesus is. So you get that starting there shapes both your view of the Old Testament and the New Testament way differently, I feel.
Yeah, so you start with this idea that, obviously Jesus didn't think that he was being or saying anything different. Right. Not only did he say, hey, the Father and I are one, we're the same, but like he didn't like, okay, guys. You've kind of missed the boat here. And to the degree that he ever did say he missed the boat, it was like you kind of misunderstood the purpose of the law.
Yeah.
And you were emphasizing certain parts to the neglect of other parts. But he never really came like he never said anything that felt like he was doing some sort of huge course correction.
Right.
Right. I mean, it just you just fine tuning a little bit, and then him as some sort of fulfillment of what the Old Testament said was coming.
Yeah, he's quoting Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Psalms, prophets. He's quoting them in the miracles he's doing. He's doing things that are very reminiscent of what Elijah did. He's teaching parables that are harkening back to Joseph. And so when you see that Jesus is basically threading his entire ministry back through almost every book of the Old Testament, for certain every kind of epic of the Old Testament, then you realize that just like you said, like he's not coming to course correct. He's basically saying like, I'm helping you to understand the purpose, the intent, the fullness of maybe things that have been missed.
Right. How would you respond to somebody if I were to say to you, man, Jesus, he's just like only nice.
Right.
You think that is a fair characterization of Jesus as just nice guy?
Nicer than me, nicer than us, but no, yeah, and so I think that's a good one too. That and I think the verse that a lot of people go to when they want to counter that idea is Jesus flipping the tables of the temple. It's like holy rage or whatever they call it. But I think even beyond that, like Jesus spoke hard truths to people. That I think one that stands out too is just this idea of the guy saying, "Hey, let me go and bury my father," and Jesus saying, "Well, let the dead bury their own dead." And some people say, "Well, what a jerk! Why do you say that? Why do you say that to that guy?" When you understand the context of it more, you understand that this guy was kind of holding on to a superstition at the time about having to be in the room at the time. That's what the spirit. Yeah,
probably that his dad probably wasn't even dead yet.
Right? Yeah, and so like you start to understand kind of like Jesus wasn't being a jerk in that situation, but like you do see that Jesus will speak hard truths. That if there's a superstition people are clinging to. If a lot of I think the thing that got him the angriest, and you see this in some of his teachings, like are when people are actively putting up barriers to keep people out of the kingdom of God, to keep people away from encountering the trueness of God, that seemed to get Jesus the angriest, and he wasn't afraid to speak boldly toward that.
Right.
So definitely loving, nicer than I've ever been, but also not backing down from speaking hard truths and confronting power structures.
Yeah, I'm referring to the Pharisees as you're like a pit of snakes.
Right.
Imagine like, hey, look, there's just like this a pit and it's full of snakes. You guys are kind of like that. Yeah. Or my favorite, I don't know if favorite's the right word. We calls them whitewashed tombs, which is like it's become such a Bible expression that's like, whitewashed tomb. Like I don't even think about what that means, but it's like what he's talking about is like you imagine like this beautiful, elaborate, super clean, beautiful, monument. It's just everything about it is beautiful, and inside of it is a dead, rotting corpse. And you're a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Hey, right? I mean, like you're pretty on the outside, but inside you are just a dead, rotting corpse.
Yep.
I mean, you've got that, and the guy who came to Zacchaeus, who was a villain in his town, and was just incredibly kind and loving to him.
Yeah.
And so I think that Jesus is just significantly more complex.
Yeah.
I think too often this question comes from a place of a real one-dimensional view of Jesus.
That's so well put.
Of just he is only nice all the time, like the grandma who's always trying to give you cookies and extra helpings and never would say no to anybody. I mean, Jesus was saying no to people all the time. Jesus was, like you said, saying hard truths. He's calling people out. And honestly, somebody was asking me this recently, was asking me about the doctrine of hell and where did it come from and where do you get most of the teachings. In fact, most of the things said about hell are said by Jesus. Mm-hmm. See, he talked about it more than Paul did, and talked about way more than he did in the Old Testament. And some people like to debate of these exactly what Jesus was talking about, what he meant by hell and the difference between Hades and Gehenna and all. I'm not trying to get into the nuances of that, but at the same time, he spoke very clearly about a place of judgment for people post-death, which is not very chill.
Yeah, right. And you touched on something too that, like, I think is just a good principle for studying the scriptures in general, especially, to this topic of kind of reading the Old Testament. Is I think there is this, because the Bible's packaged as one book, we tend to have this view of like it must have all been written at the same time by the same author,
right?
And I think there's even when you were teaching on do not murder, the 10th commandment, I'm thinking about, a good practice that I'm trying to put into place more is just to really like understand like who was saying it, what's the context of them saying it, what's their story. And, I have to wonder about Moses as, he's coming down the mountain with the 2 tablets, the 10 commandments, and he's reading them off, and do not murder's on there. And, Moses, his like most famous act is murdering an Egyptian.
He's got one on his record.
Right. And so, so I just kind of, then I put myself in the shoes of like, I wonder what was Moses thinking as he read that? Like, was it kind of like a, do not murder? Like, was it kind of like under his breath, or was he at a point in his life where he was, but it's almost a little bit trivial, speculative, but like, it helps to like put flesh on like a real person rooted in real time who hadn't seen the foundation of Israel as a nation, but was living on kind of this the stories that you see in Genesis, and start to like kind of put some depth and not this one-dimensional view of like it's just one book with a lot of words in it, but these are actual stories that have 4 dimensions through time as well. But
yeah, and I feel like in the same way, I feel like we've got the 1 or 2 dimensional Jesus rather than recognizing he's complex. I feel like we give the Old Testament God a bad rap.
Right. Yep.
Like you mentioned the story of the conquest. I mean, that's a difficult story, but it's not the only story. Mm-hmm. So if I were to say to you, man, the God of the Old Testament, he's just mean.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So first of all, if it's coming from an earnest place, valid. But then you get to Psalms, which was written, kind of 2, 3, 4, like during Israel's time. So this was after the Exodus, after the coming into the Promised Land. So a lot of the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, the conquest, some of the stories you hear in Judges, Numbers, like all that had already happened. But then you read Psalms, and it's people just talking about like how great is the love of our God. Your love endures forever. And their picture of God is this God who's loving, generous, has a heart for the nations, who wants to draw all people to him, who wants to see justice brought on earth. And so even you don't even have to go to the New Testament to get that picture of God, that even the people who were living it in real time had this view of their God as this God of just immense love and provision. And so I think you can kind of take heart in that it wasn't just people lived in fear of God, pure. And I don't mean fear like we've talked about, the good fear and the bad fear.
Right.
There's the tuck your tail anytime someone raises their hand kind of fear. I think sometimes we feel that that's the God of the Old Testament, but even the people who were living it in real time, real people living it in real time, saw this God as a God of love, and I think that's a place to start as we think about, okay, how should we be reading the Old Testament that even the people who were living in real time didn't see this God of terror and fear, but a God of love.
Yeah, several thousand years later, on the other side of the world in a completely different culture, we take our worldview and look at that and say, ugh.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who were experiencing it real time, people who were reading it, writing it, they understood that this God was a very good God.
Yeah.
They were as generous, as loving, as compassionate, as merciful, as gracious.
Mm-hmm.
These are the words, God would use to describe himself. But, okay, that's how you describe yourself. But the people talking about him also would describe him this way.
Yeah.
And so it seems like that there is something they're seeing and experiencing that a lot of us, when we read the Old Testament, that we're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like that, at least in part, this is a lens problem.
Yeah, that is so well put.
Because, we see something again that they weren't seeing. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to do And again, I want us to sitting here previewing everything, I want us on our next episode to kind of talk about the art of the wrestle. And then 3, I want us to try to just do more of a deep dive into kind of what the resolution to this is. But one of the things that I think has been really significant for me is I'm gonna read the Old Testament, especially when God is one of the main characters in the story, which is way more times than not. I'm gonna look for grace and compassion, even and if you're looking for it, you'll see it.
Yeah.
Even in the worst stories, like the two stories that people will describe as the most problematic is the worldwide flood and the conquest. But from the time that God announced that he was going to bring a worldwide flood and the execution of that was 120 years. For 120 years, both, God announced it and then had Noah as this giant witness saying, God's not real happy with us right now, and something bad is going to happen. You need to get right. And the same thing with the conquest. Not only did it take them a long time to get to the promised land the first time, but God paused them there and spun them around for another 40 years. And by the time we get to it, you've got Rahab was like, we've heard the stories. We know about your God, and
we're staying and fighting anyway.
Well, but she's like, I'm in. Right? She's like, I'm in. But everybody else was like me. So God has spent years, 40 plus years, trying to get them to live their lives differently, to think differently about God and about life. And it worked for some. It didn't work for the vast majority. But if you're looking for it, you can see it. And I've said this before, that I feel like, hey, go to the Old Testament. Man, somebody who's never seen it, read the Old Testament. This God is so patient and so gracious and so kind, and you'll see it. And if I was like, man, Jesus, he can be kind of a punk. You should read this. Like, yeah, he kind of is. But you know who's a bro? Paul. Paul's, I think, in some ways, way more chill than Jesus.
Yeah.
But in some ways not. Right. And I think we just kind of fall into these stereotypes. We fall into these narratives that someone somewhere created, and then we've just collectively decided God of the Old Testament is mean, Jesus is chill, Paul somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is, it's just an overly simplistic way of looking at things. Yeah. And so, honestly, I think that's a good stopping point, because it's a good launching point for where I think that we need to go. Because the reality of it is, I'm not trying to diminish the question, because it is a real question, because there is something that has happened. Something is very different between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There is something that's very different. And not just with that, but just even specifically around the story of the conquest, the flood. There's, things that Paul says about marriage, or things that the Bible says about sexuality. There's any number of these sorts of things where you get this difficult question and you start to wrestle. And I know that you've got some great insight on that. And so I want us to spend some time talking about that. And then we'll follow that up with just kind of more of a deep dive, and really let's really answer the question. And maybe you can help us really build a really good thread from beginning to end, and how I can trust that this God is the same God. Yeah. You down for that?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, thank you again.
Thank you,
expert Scott Sutton, for being here with us today. And thank you, all of us, for joining us here in the Cultivate podcast. Really glad that you are here with us. And I encourage you, come back for these next couple episodes. Scott and I are going to keep this conversation going, and hope to see you soon. Thank you for listening to the Cultivate podcast. Our hope is that you are taking steps to go deeper in your faith, that you are asking big questions and you're looking for answers. We hope that we can be a resource for you through our podcast and any other way that we can help you. You can find all our episodes anywhere that you can find podcasts, including YouTube. And again, thank you so much for joining us.